Today, we're going to take a look at East Asia and the Pacific Rim after World War II. We're going to start off by looking at East Asia, particularly Japan, and then we will look at China and Vietnam as some case studies. Japan will emerge as an industrial power after World War II, mostly in automobiles and electronics. But again, they already had a long tradition of industrialization and being strong at it prior to World War II, going back to the late 1800s, early 1900s when they started to industrialize. But unlike before World War II, where they went and took over places through imperialism to gain their natural resources, to manufacture their products, now they're going to be trading equally with other nations to gain their own materials that they need to do their manufacturing. Despite a long period of colonization either by other Asian nations or by Western nations, many Asian nations continue to hold on to their long cultural heritage. Korea, China, the Philippines continue to hold on to what made them uniquely Filipino, Korean, and so forth. What you're also going to see is China and Vietnam are going to see full-scale revolutions, both being communist, that will end the influence of Confucianism. China a little bit earlier in between 1945 and 1949, and Vietnam a little bit later in the late 1960s, early 1970s. All right, let's talk about Japan a little bit. After World War II, the United States took Japan's surrender, and the U.S. is going to occupy Japan for about the course of about 10 years. General MacArthur is going to see that transition, that occupation under American forces, and what the U.S. is trying to do during that time period is kind of break that stronghold of loyalty to the emperor, that loyalty mindset that Japan has had for many centuries. So what is going to happen is that the military forces are disbanded. To this day, Japan has a very small military force for defensive purposes. The first time they were deployed outside of Japan since World War II was in 2001, when they helped to set up some field hospitals in Afghanistan after 9/11. Shintoism is going to be ended for at least a period of time because the United States saw that as an influence behind the emperor worship and the strong nationalism that Japan had going into World War II, but it has since had a resurgence in Japan since the US has left. What you're also going to see is a democratization and a new constitution develop in Japan, where every man has a right to vote regardless of property status, and women will also gain suffrage. Women over time will gain more rights, but there are some things still in Japan that are very ingrained in their culture that did not change with the US coming in. Some things that remained with Japan. One, respect for elders. There is very much ingrained in the Asian culture that the US did not change. Another thing is group conscience. That consciousness that was very built on nationalism before is now going to be more just for the society as a whole, even taken down a little bit nearer to your family or a little step up working for your company. So many Japanese workers work very long hours, take very few vacations. That's starting to change now with the younger generations, but for many years, the baby boomer generation, as an equivalent in Japan, in the United States, people born right after World War II and in the 50s and 60s worked very hard, stayed with one company for many years, worked 10, 12-hour days, 6 days a week, worked very hard, and you worked for the company. They took care of you and you took care of them. The government's going to focus very much on education and providing you with a job afterwards. Kind of your education is going to kind of funnel you towards that job that you're looking for. And government's also going to be based on how well you do. You get rewarded, your job gets rewarded based on how hard you work. If you're just going to kind of goof off and be lazy, you're not going to get promoted. You will get promoted by for how hard you work. And that's also going to encourage the long hours and things like that people that culture that is promulgated throughout Japan. What you will see is the main political party in Japan will be the Liberal Democratic Party. They'll dominate politics until the 1990s, but that party is bereft with corruption, change of prime ministers, a lot of fighting within the party as time goes on. And as I said, the Liberal Democratic Party, it's going to be a multiplayer system, but these guys are going to win most of the elections until the 1980s, late 80s, early 90s. Their success was due to the fact that they would consult with the opposition and give them a voice. Japan does promote birth control and abortion, as well as obviously education. Studies have shown that in societies where women have more education, they tend to have smaller families. But there's also a trade-off with this, is that Japan has a grayer population at this point, that there are more older people than younger people. And that's starting to become a problem because there aren't enough workers to take jobs in Japan at this point. And there's more concern that that's going to be even a greater issue as time goes on. What has helped Japan's economic surge? One is that the money that the government had been spending on building up the military is now going to go into focusing on industry. So again, going back to the foundation of the modern Japanese government and moving from the shogunate to the Meiji Restoration, and then hence more of the government today, there has always been a very close tie with business and government. So for businesses that the government thought were money makers and would benefit the country, they would give them tax breaks and support them as best as they could. The government also encouraged obviously certain industries as mentioned before, and necessary education. So particularly, again, Japan has excelled in sciences, technology-based industries where you require a lot of science and mathematics education. So there's been a strong emphasis on education, but that is not unique because a lot of East Asian nations place a strong emphasis on education. So it's not just your normal, maybe 7-hour school day, it's additional tutoring and extra classes on top of that so you can succeed. As mentioned before, just within the Japanese culture, there's a strong work ethic and loyalty to the company, which used to be loyalty to the emperor. Before that, it was loyalty to your lord. Now it's going to be to the company. And even if you disagree with the management's decision, you're still going to honor that because you're being loyal. And so Japan has never really had a lot of unions because of that, and those have been suppressed. So you really don't have a lot of workers striking and things like that. It's never been a characteristic of the Japanese working class. All right, women and children in Japanese society. As the 1950s went on and gone on today, women in Japan mirrored their counterparts in the West. A lot of them worked outside the home, but also were expected to continue to take care of the children and household responsibilities as well. Children are taught conformity, very much, again, going along with that nationalistic mindset of loyalty to the emperor, respect your elders, very similar thing. You obey your elders, you respect them, you do what you're told. Again, not a lot of independence and things like that. But there is tension in Japan of the younger generations not necessarily wanting to go with that conformity mindset. And you're starting to see some change in Japan. The Japanese have been fascinated by baseball, going back to the late 1800s when some Americans were working in Japan and they started a baseball club, an informal athletic club where they would just get together on weekends and play baseball. Since then, the Japanese have been fascinated to the point now where you have several Japanese baseball players sign in the United States in the major leagues. So if you're talking about players coming into the United States from outside of the continental U.S., the number one players mostly coming from the Dominican Republic, primarily the Caribbean, and then outside that you have Korea, South Korea, and Japan are the two other areas where you see a lot of baseball players come who've played in the majors in Japan and then come over and had somewhat success in the major leagues. And you start to see is respecting elders important in Japan. It's always been that way. Again, going back to some of that Confucian influence a little bit, respecting your elders. Well, is that really important? Also tied to Confucianism. Eating with knives and forks as opposed to chopsticks. And again, environmental issues they've been struggling with because of the industrialization. Japan is a small island nation, but the majority of populations live in the cities, which compounds the pollution issue. And how do they preserve what they do have? And how much are they willing to put environmental controls on the populations to preserve the resources that they have? All right, we're going to shift gears here a little bit and talk about Korea. All right, as we talked about before, a little bit about the Korean War. At the end of World War II, Korea was divided along the 30th parallel. And you had the Republic of South Korea versus the People's Democratic Republic of North Korea, or Democratic Republic of Korea. What you're going to have is in Northern Korea, you're going to have leadership under the Kim family, and they are going to take influence from the Soviet Union, who will provide them with weapons and supplies, and they will develop a relationship with China. South Korea will be under the leadership of more of an authoritarian government, but they weren't communist, so they supported them. The idea was that North and South Korea were to be united under elections shortly after World War II. But the problem is North Korea invades South Korea to get this unification process happening sooner. The problem with that is that a lot of the international community saw this as a violation of the South Korean sovereignty, that the people didn't want to join with North Korea at that point. So the UN Security Council took a vote, and they said that this was an unlawful action. So they sent troops in along with the US, kind of led the invasion, to help defend South Korea. From 1950 to 1953, they're going to go back and forth. Once the US and the UN troops cross over that 30th parallel, China is going to get involved in the action because it's very close to their border, North Korea's border and China. So they consider a threat to them. So the Chinese are going to volunteer forces to help North Korea. China and North Korea have had a very tight relationship for a long time because they, again, are two communist nations in East Asia. Again, 1953, you're going to have a stalemate that just goes back and forth, each of them invading each other. Korea has been divided since then along the 30th parallel. Tensions right now are pretty tight between both nations as North Korea develops nuclear weapons. There has been back and forth with both countries, with North Korea and the world in regards to having them stop it because of the instability of the leadership of North Korea and concerns about would they actually use the weapon to threaten their neighbors, Japan, South Korea. China is the only one that seems to have any muscle with them because they are North Korea's major trading partner and they provide a lot of aid to North Korea. The biggest thing with North Korea is if you see this map down here, the lights you see here, this is Phnom, which is the capital of North Korea. Here you see, this is South Korea. There aren't a lot of lights in North Korea because population is concentrated into one major city, but the rest of North Korea is mostly rural. And the majority of the economy in North Korea is spent on military weapons, budgets, and things like that. A lot of people in North Korea are starving. The average 5-year-old in North Korea is about 2 inches shorter than their South Korean counterpart. So there's a lot of instability in North Korea. And China seems to be the one that they'll listen to. But that is a big concern with Korea at this point. The current leader of North Korea is Kim Jong-un, and he's a big basketball fan. Dennis Rodman's come to visit him. Dennis Rodman played for at least one team, the Chicago Bulls, in the late 80s, early 90s, and that is his idol. South Korea is Syngman Rhee was a leader in the late 80s, early 90s. He was forced out because of how he was leading things during the 80s, but he's been more frisked with authoritarian leaders, and most opposition had been suppressed. Right now, South Korea's current leader was voted out of office because of corruption. There's a temporary leader in place at least for a couple of months, but he's probably going to be voted out of power. I mean, he's going to step down from power, and then a new leader will be elected. A lot of the emphasis has been on economic growth. What South Korea has done is to find a niche mostly with electronics and car manufacturing, particularly Hyundai. Hyundai and Kia are both both cars that come out of South Korea, and Hyundai pretty much has a huge stronghold on the South Korean government. What they are able to do is they provide housing and schools and recreation facilities for their workers. In exchange, they have their workers work 6 days a week and only provide 3 vacation days a year. Some people have argued that they don't treat their workers very well, but they produce a good car. So the question is, Hyundai is definitely taking advantage of the lower labor cost in South Korea, but Hyundai is also it is a Korean company, so that also might account for part of that situation. So some of the results of South Korea's economic boom: one was a population increase. The government encouraged limitations on birth rates, such as the use of birth control, abortion as well, to help that population numbers go down. Because of all the industry in South Korea, we're trying to combat pollution and smog as well. Income from your average citizen in South Korea has grown, and very much like the United States, even the poor in South Korea are better off than most folks in less developed countries. So South Korea's standard of living is increasing quite a bit due to the economic changes that are going on. And these are pictures of Seoul, which is the capital. So South Korea is very similar to a lot of developed, almost semi-peripheral nations that have industrialized and that are doing pretty well. Taiwan has been throughout its history predominantly a province of China, and for part of the time it was under the control of the Japanese prior to World War II. The Guangdong, or the Nationalist Party of China, took over Taiwan after their loss in the Chinese Civil War in 1949. What is going to happen is that they are going to flee China after their defeat under Mao Zedong, and they are going to take over Taiwan. Now, there are native Taiwanese who live in Taiwan, but they are going to be subjected to the control of the Chinese, and they will be subjugated to the Chinese and not have as many rights with the Chinese nationalists ruling Taiwan. Hostilities with China continue, particularly because of the fact that for at least about 10 years after the UN was founded, Taiwan was considered to be, by the United States and a lot of the world, the official China, but then that changed in the early 1960s, and the People's Republic of China became what people recognize as China. There is tension, obviously, between the two because China still recognizes, Communist China still sees Taiwan as a part of China, and they consider it to be kind of a rebellious province. The communists will attack Taiwan every once in a while. The U.S. was giving economic aid to Taiwan until the 1960s. They have stopped doing that. There was recently a scuffle between Taiwan and China when the president of Taiwan called to congratulate our current president on his inauguration and returned the phone call, and that got China upset because since the 1970s we've had a one China policy where we've recognized communist China as the only China. We still do exercises with Taiwan, and we sell them weapons, but we do not call them China. So that caused a little bit of tension there. Taiwan has focused on economic planning like Japan and South Korea. What they have seized upon was their low cost of labor. They have lots of labor. So they've encouraged education, private business. The U.S. committed to Taiwan ended in 1978. They established diplomatic relations with China. Japan is Taiwan's main trading partner, but the U.S. does trade with Taiwan as well. In recent years, Chiang Ching-kuo, who was the son of Chiang Kai-shek, took over after his father and continued to kind of be authoritarian, but was more open to giving the Taiwanese more rights and to not be as authoritarian as his dad. Hong Kong was obviously seized from the Chinese and succeeded to the British in the Opium Wars in the 1840s Treaty of Nanking. But what's going to happen is that it was a British colony, but the British gave it more and more autonomy. But ultimately, in 1997, it was given back to China as an agreement because the 99-year lease was up, with the promise that for 50 years, China had to allow it to continue to have a free market economy. Now, Hong Kong has blossomed since its independence, since it was returning to China. China has allowed it to continue on its capitalistic economy. So because of its labor market, Hong Kong manufactures a lot of goods cheaply because their workers aren't paid very much. There has been some tension between China and Hong Kong because of the fact that Hong Kong is more democratic than the rest of China. So we will see how that trend continues over time. Hong Kong, again, as I mentioned before, is kind of a bridge between the capitalist West and the rest of the world, with China being communist. They're really a leader in international banking. They have high-tech sectors, again, like I said, textiles, heavy industry as well because of that low cost of labor. Most workers have long hours and low wages, but it makes higher profit for the companies. And again, as mentioned before, China promised when they received Hong Kong back in 1997 that they would respect the free market system and the political rights within the state. So they want to treat it as a city-state for at least 50 years. And we'll see what happens after that. All right, Singapore was a former British colony, now is a city-state. It became independent in 1965. Until 1971, it contained a British naval base in the area. Today, it is still a very major trading port in the area, particularly in its confluence between East Asia and Southeast Asia. Another big thing with Singapore, it has become a huge place for international banking. A lot of transnational corporations have headquarters in Singapore. It has also seized upon its low cost of labor and has a lot of manufacturing there as well. Another thing with Singapore is that there are very tight controls by the government. It's considered as a very clean city. There are, again, it has very large population, so the government sees that they need tight controls, such as the government regulates sexual behavior. You can't throw gum on the street, you'll get arrested. They weed out corruption. Many years ago, there was an American teenager who keyed a car over in Singapore because his mom was working there. They were on vacation. I don't remember exactly the particulars, but he received the punishment of caning. He basically whipped over the back with bamboo, and the U.S. government didn't step in because he committed a crime. So Singapore's success, it's the fourth largest port in the world. It's, like I mentioned before, a huge international banking, and it manufactures textiles, electronics, oil refinery, and shipbuilding. All right, common themes in the Pacific Rim. So these are, again, countries that kind of rim the Pacific. One, strong focus on the economy, group loyalty to the country and also to your company that you're working for, a very strong work ethic. We call these guys little tigers, so the rising influence of India, Malaysia, and Thailand. But the biggest thing is that what you have is all of these guys they found an economic area that they could focus on, whether it might be exporting, say, coffee in Indonesia or manufacturing in Malaysia. And the same with Thailand, a little mixture of exporting raw materials, but also manufacturing. If they could seize upon that and not necessarily be as dependent upon the West or not, the problem was is that they still were dependent upon the West because who they were selling to was mostly Western companies. China's a little different story, so let's talk about China. You're familiar with China mostly due to reading Red Scarf Girl, which you're about halfway through at this point. Again, China at this point, going into after World War II, is a very divided country. In the north, you have the communists. In the south, you have the nationalists. The north are led by Mao Zedong. In the south, they are being led by Chiang Kai-shek. When the Japanese started invading China in the 1930s, the Chinese people suffered very badly under Japanese, as they were brutal to pretty much any place that they took over in East Asia. The communists did have some success, though, against the Japanese, using the guerrilla warfare that they had honed fighting the nationalists, and they will win a lot of supporters because they were able to at least fight against the Japanese, which the nationals did not do. After the war is over, the World War II is over, the nationalists will continue to lose ground in the south. The businessmen that Chiang Kai-shek made promises to, those promises do not come true. So they will start to go to Mao's side, particularly the military. They see Chiang Kai-shek as corrupt and not fulfilling his promises and unique, particularly after losing and not being able to defend people against the Japanese. So they will rally to the communists. And in the end, after fighting for 4 years, the nationalists are defeated and they will flee to Taiwan. So what does China look like under Mao? Well, Mao will establish the government at Beijing. He will call it People's Republic of China. Lin Biao will be one of his gifted commanders, kind of mostly his prime minister. What you're going to see is that the government is going to be mostly run by a bunch of activists that will dominate China and oversee the army, which is called the People's Liberation Army. This is a picture of them marching. So China is very nationalistic. They're going to have a strong military, and they are going to be a one-party country, political party. One thing is that China is going to try and find as many communist friends as it can. So it's going to have an influence in North Korea. They will initially become very strong friends with the Soviet Union, but Mao Zedong will very shortly into the beginning of the country break off relations with Stalin because he thinks Stalin is not communist enough. He also wants to kind of be the biggest, baddest communist guy in the world, have the biggest reputation. And because they share a border, China and the Soviet Union share a border, they fight over territory. Over time, China will also fight a border with India because of Tibet, and India will lose that conflict because of the fact that of testing, China and India both testing nuclear devices as well. So China will win that border war. All right. For a brief time, the Chinese government gives land back to the peasants, but eventually all of the Chinese population will be living on communal farms under the Great Leap Forward, which is a program that Mao will introduce. I'll talk about that shortly. What you're going to have is that there's a division in the Communist Party. Mao wants to take the peasants back, to make everybody kind of back to more of a peasant-based society, because he sees agriculture. He sees the peasants as the true backbone of China. Whereas you see other folks in the Communist Party who want to industrialize, they see that as the future of China. So what the radicals are going to do is they want to obviously give the country back to the peasants. So they're going to essentially put everybody on these huge communes. So doctors, lawyers, peasants, artists, teachers are going to live in these communes essentially. You're going to have to grow your own food, manufacture, produce anything that you need, and you're all going to share it equally. This is called the Great Leap Forward, or maybe backwards. So one, Mao is going to very much like Stalin set up goals for manufacturing food, things like that. The food, China is going to be set with drought, pests, outbreaks of different plagues of like pests as well during this time period. So they have bad harvest along with trying to get all these people to become farmers. So as a result, we get to the point where people are eating like tree bark. So millions starve during the Great Leap Forward. He also wants to have, doctors and lawyers make things with their hands. So he encourages people to make steel by themselves. So they build these backyard furnaces, but they're not designed to really smelt down steel or create steel. So what they make is very brittle, and in fact, they're basically melting down what they already have to create new steel. And so what you're going to have ultimately is this huge population spike in China. And what he says is he doesn't want to use birth control because that's like a Western thing. So he starts to limit China's population to 1 child per family to deal with this population explosion. And what's going to happen is because Mao, the Great Leap Forward, was such a travesty, he's going to lose his position as the head of the Communist Party, or the state chairman, but he will kind of still be head of the Central Committee. And then you're going to have 2 more practical people take over after that. Women in China. Madame Chiang Kai-shek tries to, when the nationalists are in power in the South, have women be more traditional. Take care of the house, keep your husband happy, things like that. Mao does things differently. He ends foot binding. He lets women come and hang out with men. He opens up jobs and educational opportunities for women. So he understands that you need women to make things work, and women need to be treated equally. So that is going to be a big difference. Women are going to take on some leadership roles within the Communist Party, but again, the top positions are pretty much reserved for men, or unless you have connections. Like Mao's wife was a high leader in the Communist Party. Women still are going to fight against that traditional view, though. They want to, again, very much like in the West, they want to work full-time, but still take care of, that household. They want to be able to do both. Starting in the 1960s, you were going to have what we call the Cultural Revolution. Mao is starting to lose ground here, so he basically starts a grassroots campaign against the folks that are trying to kind of push him out of power, and he rallies the youth within China. He's basically blaming Western influence to saying that's where the problems in China. So he is going to basically go on a witch hunt. So he's going to create his little red book that has what is true to be a good communist. He's going to utilize the youth. So the Red Guard are high school students, the Red Successors are junior high kids, and they have the liberty to go and harass people who aren't following what is considered to be a good communist. Many people are rounded up and beaten by the Red Guard, publicly humiliated. You have the Dowsy bows that are written about people to humiliate them. But then you have posters like this as well that proclaim, how to be a good communist and things like that. Many of Mao's rivals are put on trial, either shot publicly or hung. By 1968, people think the movement's gone too far, and the army disbands the Red Guard before things get even crazier. So what you're going to have is the Gang of Four versus the Pragmatists. So the Gang of Four basically says that the pragmatists, who are communists, are too capitalist. So this is an attempt to overthrow the pragmatists and set up their own type of government. One of the leaders is Mao's wife. her and the other 3 members are sentenced to life in prison. And one of the pragmatists, Danielle Payne, will come to power after this kind of civil war breaks out a little bit within the Communist Party. What Danielle Payne is going to do is he is going to allow capitalism to come into China, but with some reservations. So what he's going to do is he's going to end the communes. He's going to encourage private investment, whether Chinese or Western, in land and in industry. He's going to open up for foreign companies to come in and build factories. And that's why China is where it is today. You have a very authoritarian government who controls many aspects of his people's lives, but you have a booming economy as a result of people like Danielle Payne. So China today, some successes of the Communist Revolution. 1, poverty does remain, and people's lives are better off than they had ever been before in China. Majority of people in China are still relatively poor, and they do live in rural areas. They have a higher rate of industrial growth than most of the other countries in East Asia. Most population have access to food, education, and healthcare than other developing nations in East Asia. China really has done all this, again, very much like Japan, without outside help. And they are on track to become industrially stronger. They are growing one of the largest militaries as well, and a stronger population. So this is an example of population growth between China and Europe from 1650 to now. As of right now, India is slated to outpace China's growth by about 20 to 50. All right, Vietnam, and I'll close with Vietnam. We talked about before, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia were under French control as colonies in the early 1800s. Between 1800 and 1840, let me correct that, France, Laos, and Cambodia came under French control. Initially, it was trading, and then it became a full-fledged colony, and the Catholic Church brought in a lot of missionaries to try and convert the Buddhists in China to Catholicism. A lot of the peasants in Vietnam were used for exploitations for resources that were in the rich, dense jungles and rainforest of Vietnam. What you're going to have is during the 1930s and early 40s, when Vietnam is being invaded by Japan, you're going to have some political parties arise. So what you're going to have, first of all, is you're going to have the rise of French-educated Vietnamese elites. You're going to have the Communist Party led by Ho Chi Minh. And so the VNKDD is kind of more of the elite who are going to rule Vietnam for the most part, particularly in the south. The Viet Minh are actually, Ho Chi Minh, who's going to lead the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh are communists who are in charge mostly in the north. And they are going to help spy on the Japanese during World War II for the Allies. What you're going to have is the guerrilla forces who are going to help push the Japanese out of Vietnam. What's going to happen is after World War II, the French are going to try and go in and recapture Vietnam. They're going to be pushed out by guerrilla forces in Vietnam. So Vietnam is going to be divided along the 17th parallel. And the U.S. is going to oversee the south. The Russians are going to help and assist with overseeing the north. And obviously the Viet Minh are going to be in the north. And so communism is already really strong in the north. Unlike Korea, communism was kind of there, but communism had been strong in North Vietnam for a while. So what's going to happen is that the U.S. ceased to support Diem in the south. He's very big on getting rid of the opposition, and that's not going to help. You do have a lot of communists in the south, though, that are ready to aid the communists in the north. They're called the Viet Cong. So the U.S. is going to orchestrate the assassination of Diem and then put somebody else in there. But the problem is that starting in the 1950s, the U.S. is going to provide military advisors. In the 60s, we're going to put boots on the ground as troops. But the U.S. cannot overtake the Viet Cong. They know the land. They have tactics that they cannot and they have the will. They want to be united with their communist brothers in the North. And ultimately, by 1973, the U.S. pulls out of Vietnam. There's a ceasefire that's called. By 1975, negotiations fail between North and South Vietnam, and the North invades the South completely, and it's been a communist country ever since. A lot is a common situation in Vietnam. The monks would basically ignite themselves on fire to protest the harsh regime of Diem in the South. That was not uncommon during the time period. Vietnam and the results of Vietnam, the war. The U.S. is going to cut off relations until the 1990s under Bill Clinton under Vietnam, and they were completely isolated for a long time. But the leaders in Vietnam still have a communist system, but they're trying to open it up to more economic stability. With investment in Europe and Japan, they've liberalized the economy, they've opened it up. The U.S. has improved relations with Vietnam, and they've been able to kind of at least get information on missing family members who were POWs in Vietnam during the war. And the biggest thing is that you were starting to see kind of an issue with Vietnam becoming part of the world economy is the fact that as communism has kind of declined a bit, you have more of a disparity between who has access to education and healthcare in Vietnam. So they've not weathered that transition into the world market as much as China has. Ultimately, what is going on in East Asia and Southeast Asia? On one hand, you have a blending of capitalism and communism, particularly in Vietnam and in China. You have the rise of Asian giants like Japan and China, and the little tigers like Hong Kong and Singapore. But what you also have is the strong East Asian and Southeast Asian cultural traditions that are adapting and changing with their involvement in the Western world. They're maintaining their identity, but they're also changing somewhat with the Western ideas coming in. And that's East and Southeast Asia for you guys.